Um, and just maybe give a few instructions that might be helpful as we go through tonight. You'll notice that all but the host and the speaker are now muted. And that's to give optimum environment to hear the speaker. We also suggest that once Gail begins her presentation, participants turn off their video during the talk, and that will give us better connectivity and a smoother transmission of the feed. It sounds like I really know what I'm talking about when I say that. But it's worked in the past sessions. Both the microphone button and the video button on the left-hand bottom of your screen, you probably know that already. And if you're having trouble with the audio, even with the mic on, check the volume on your computer. Each program, as Susan just indicated, will be recorded, and the link will be shared with participants after the series is completed. Now, if you don't want to have your smiling face on the recording, turn off your video camera right now. You can make comments at any time by opening the chat option by clicking on that button in the middle of the bottom of your screen. And that's also the place where you can ask questions. Anytime you have a question that occurs to you, open the chat and click on the drop-down box that's labeled Everyone and select Marge Sears and then type your question. And Marge will screen and record the questions as they come in, and she'll read as many as possible to the speaker during the question and answer time. And we'll have, I think, a good amount of time for questions, and we'll end by 9 o'clock. Jesu Peace and Justice Committee and the Beloved Community are the co-sponsors of this series, which is continued from last winter when it was halted by the pandemic. And many of you may know that the series included an introductory session on the principles of nonviolence taken from Pachi Benny's From Violence to Wholeness. There was a session on domestic violence, a session on Bridging the Divide, which featured violence de-escalation. There was the nonviolence, the section on the nonviolence of Daniel Berrigan, and then, of course, tonight's session on Gandhi's contribution to nonviolence. There's also a session near the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday given by John Thorne, the Executive Director of the Detroit Catholic Pastoral Alliance, on the history of African Americans in the Catholics in the Diocese of Detroit, and as well as current concerns and issues by that community with the diocese. The principles and practice of nonviolence, as we have seen throughout this program, are needed even more today. And we are grateful to our presenters and to all of you who are here tonight for taking the time to join us. And we hope that you'll take away practical ideas and actions that you can use in everyday living. After the end of the series tonight, we will send out an action guide with useful websites and organizations to further inform and challenge you to practice nonviolence. Now, before I introduce our speaker in a more formal fashion, I would like to start with a prayer. And this is a prayer from Mahatma Gandhi. So if we could just take a minute and quiet ourselves. My Lord, help me to tell the truth in front of strong people and not to lie to obtain the applause of the weak ones. If you give me a fortune, do not take away my reasoning. If you give success, do not take away my humbleness. If you give me humbleness, do not take away my dignity. Always help me to see the other face of the coin. Do not let me think I betray others who do not think just as I do. Teach me to love people as myself And do not let me fall in pride if I succeed, nor in desperation if I fail. Rather, remind me that failure is the experience that supersedes the triumph. Teach me that forgiveness is a greatness sign and revenge is a vile signal. If you take success from me, give me encouragement to learn from failure. If I would offend people, give me encouragement to apologize to them. And if people offend me, give me encouragement to forgive them. Lord, if I ever forget you, please never forget me. Amen. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Many of you know Gail Presbey already, but I'd like to just say a few things more formally about her background. She's going to speak to us tonight on Gandhi's contributions to the development of nonviolent activism. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Detroit Mercy and director of the James Carney Latin American Solidarity Archives in the History Department. She's been director since 2002, right up to the present. Her areas of expertise are philosophy of nonviolence and African philosophy, with current studies and research on Africa, Latin America, Mohandas Gandhi's movement, feminism, and Pan-Africanism. She has published 4 edited books and over 50 articles and book chapters. She completed her PhD in philosophy at Fordham University, and she also has completed a graduate certificate program in world history at Wayne State University. In addition to philosophy courses, she also teaches African history and politics and Latin American history, philosophy, and liberation theology. And she has chaperoned college student groups to Mexico and El Salvador and accompanied students to Guatemala for volunteer work and Cuba for study. And finally, word on the street is that Gail sponsors more speakers at the University of Detroit Mercy than almost all the other professors there put together. And those of us at JZU have had the good fortune to be geographically close enough to the university to take advantage of many of those speakers, and it's been really rewarding. So be sure to check the CLASA website on upcoming events. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gail. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this chance to get to share with you some things that I've really enjoyed learning about Gandhi. And I did want to say, when I first mentioned I would give this talk, I said, oh, I want to do it on the development of nonviolent activism. But having been to your last 2 weeks and seeing how prayerful they are, I thought I want to start by making sure I also talk about Gandhi's prayerfulness and his understanding of religions and his openness to world religions. And since it was so valuable when Bill told some stories about his personal experiences with Berrigan, well, I'm a little too young to tell you about my personal experiences with Gandhi, but I can at least tell you that I have met people who met Gandhi, and I've interviewed them, and they've been part of my research. So I will share some of that with you too. And then after I do that, then I'm going to get to the development of nonviolent activism. So you'll see me halfway, I'll segue and I'll go back in time like they do in the movies, including that 3-hour Richard Attenborough movie. He starts out and then he goes, now let's go back to Gandhi's early years. So halfway through, I'll do something like that. But I hope you I hope you enjoy it. And I also look forward to answering any questions you might have. So let's start out with Sevagram Ashram. This is where Gandhi first, not first, but actually where he last lived. He developed this ashram wherever he lived for all the years he was an active nonviolent activist. He really insisted on living in community, a community of people dedicated to nonviolence. And Sevagram Ashram is just one of the last places that he lived in Maharashtra state. And when I was there, um, first of all, you can see that one method of daily prayer is the spinning at the wheel, the charkha, which was a meditation for Gandhi, a very important meditation. And you might wonder, how is spinning a meditation? Well, sometimes I think about how the Buddha said, I don't know if you remember that sentence when the Buddha had his enlightenment. He overheard somebody say, a fisherman, if you pull the string too taut, it breaks. But if it's too loose, it doesn't work either. Oh, the musician, the string has to be just right. So spinning is like that. It has to be just right. And so you have to concentrate. And that's part of the whole idea of making sure it's it's like a yoga of concentration, but it not only focuses the mind, but you also have to be very conscious of what you're doing with your hands, just pulling or slacking just right. Of course, there was so much symbolism with the charkha as well, because the fact that people could spin their own thread and weave their own clothes was a way in which they could have, which agricultural people could have economic self-sufficiency. So that was part of the idea there. But when I was at Sevagram Ashram and we had a daily prayer service, and this is a picture from when I was there, I was surprised they started out with Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. They started with this Buddhist chant for world peace. And then they also read from the Vedas, the Upanishad, the Quran. They wanted to be an all embracing movement. Whatever your spirituality, you could come and be part of it. This was another reason he used the charkha, right? It was a way that he tried to cultivate the quality of patience and angerlessness. A true spinner must have unlimited patience. And it's true because it takes a long time just to spin a little bit of thread. But by going through this daily prayer of patience, where you have to control your self anger, it's like, drat, I, I broke the string again. I'm such a goofball now. Okay, overcome that anger, cultivate that quality. A true spinner must have unlimited patience. And then he would say things like, violence is impatience, and nonviolence is patience. And I try to remember that because oftentimes I'm a little impatient in life. And not just impatient with, I have a lot of things to do, but why isn't that other person getting it already? No, no, no. Uh, we need patience with ourselves and with each other. And this is a tree, speaking of patience, it takes many years for a tree to grow. And so this is a tree that Gandhi planted. And this is where they gather for their prayer. So another thing that Gandhi said is he didn't want to always have to build churches. We could gather under a tree and have our prayer services there and have our political action meetings there. Why always? He did sometimes gather in a theater, but there was also this, let's gather outdoors. And as you can see on the right, he believed in simple living. He had almost no personal objects. He lived a very Spartan life, and that was also part of his spirituality. He didn't want to be attached to material things. These were where we had our meals. As you can see, we all sit on the floor, and these meals are still cooked. Now, that is a wood stove. It does have a chimney, so we don't have to breathe in the fumes, but it's a very simple technology. Now, way back at Savagram in the same scenario, eating on the floor, someone like Yogananda was there. And Yogananda, being somebody who really cared about and was devoted to meditation techniques. And Gandhi would host someone like that and learn from someone like that. And then he pursued his own spirituality, which took in things from Hinduism and insights from Christianity and insights from Islam and the Buddhists. Oh, here's a case where I had a chance to spin along with all the students of a university, which was in Sabarmati. This university, Gujarat Vidyapeeth, was a university modeled on Gandhi's guidelines. They took in students who were considered marginalized students, perhaps from no caste, low caste, or no caste, Adivasi students. And the whole student body and all the teachers and administrators did meditation on the charka a half hour a day. I couldn't believe it. The dean of students and all these professors, along with the students, were engaged in the daily meditation. And over the years, I've been at different universities in India, and they're like that. I was at another university, Maharashtra Institute of Technology, where every day a world peace prayer came out over loudspeakers, and wherever people were at 10:30 a.m., they paused and did nothing but pray for those 10 minutes of the broadcast prayer. So now, I also had a chance to meet some communities in India today where people live together, and this is a woman's community, Brahmavidya Mandir, and it was founded by Vinoba Bhave. Vinoba Bhave was a follower of Gandhi who continued Gandhi's work after Gandhi passed away. And Vinoba Bhave wanted there to be a woman's ashram because he felt that uh, women should have this opportunity to live together in a prayerful way. Gandhi's ashrams always had families, both men and women, but this was a gathering of women. And I got to stay there for several days. And while I was there, I had a chance to interview some of the folks who lived there. So Devi Rigwani was one of the ones I got to talk to. And she's even written a little booklet on women's spirituality. And she wanted to say, women being creators, they possess more love. God is invisible, but the way that God functions is visible through women. So I wanted to have a chance to tell you about some of the women followers of Gandhi, because maybe some of the men are more famous, but there are many wonderful women devotees. And the women who live here, they're involved in self-sufficient farming. It's almost like we have here with our community gardens, except this is a gathering of 40 or so women, and they're self-sufficient from their garden. And they get up at 4 in the morning to begin prayers before the sun starts rising at 5:30 in the morning. And this community, they also all sleep outdoors. So I was with them sleeping outdoors. And part of it is you see these buildings, they have tin roofs. I don't know if you can see the edge of that. There's a tin roof here. And in the middle of the day, it was 110 degrees. So you didn't really want to spend a lot of time under a hot tin roof that stayed warm at night. And I saw so many stars, more stars that I've seen in a long time, sleeping outdoors with the other sisters um, in their compound next to their farm. Very devoted, very spiritual community. Now, I wanted to talk about some of the background. You know, there have been Christians in India for a long time, and I did have a chance to visit the Christian churches of Goa and the beautiful artworks and reliquaries. And since you know, I'm teaching at University of Detroit Mercy, and you're all there at Jesu, the Jesuit uh, parish. I just thought I'd let you know the Jesuit church in Goa has the relics of St. Francis Xavier, which I was able to visit there at the Basilica of Bom Jesus. So there is a very long Christian history. There's also the Syrian Orthodox Church that's been in India for many years. And they would talk about St. Thomas, St. Thomas of Malabar had come to India, and so their church has been in connection with the other Eastern Rite churches for hundreds of years. I was able to see some of their processions through the streets of India, very devout. Of course, I've seen many Hindu processions through the streets too, but also Christian, Catholic, Syrian Orthodox processions. I was able to go to Vaikom. I really wanted to go to Vaikom Temple because I had read so much about it. You might know that one of the big Satyagraha nonviolent actions in India was at Vaikom Temple. That was because the Brahmins who were in charge there at the time didn't want any untouchables to even walk past the temple because they would defile them. And Gandhi and others challenged this. I do want you to know, though, that there was a long-standing movement at Vaikom to protest this untouchability, even before Gandhi got involved. So Gandhi was like the star. He came at a certain point, but there had been a grassroots movement working to end untouchability for a long time. And some people even thought that Gandhi was too conciliatory. He spent too much time listening to the Brahmins talk about why they didn't want untouchables walking. But that was Gandhi's way. He was trying to bring people together, talk and listen to all parties. But Vaikom Temple did finally say, okay, we will no longer prohibit untouchables from our temple. And it was a big movement. It was just one part of a spreading movement over the years to get rid of caste discrimination in India, which was a very important issue for Gandhi. While we were in this Vaikom temple, we saw these performances. These are performances of stories from the Hindu scriptures that always have a moral to the story, and these are Kathakali dancers performing in the Vaikom temple. I also had a chance to see some of the more historical temples while I was there. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Ellora and Ajanta Caves. They are actually very close to Sevagram Ashram. And these were caves, whole buildings, several story buildings carved out of rock. And right next to each other, there were Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain temples next to each other. So we're so used to thinking, oh, the religions are separate and they each have their own doctrines. But these temples were near each other. And Gandhi was somebody who really learned a lot from Jainism because when he grew up in India, he was in Porbandar, which was near a big Jain community there in Gujarat. So these are just some amazing pictures from these caves over 1,000 years old, and very extensive caves. And here's one of the Buddha statues. These are some of the Jain carvings. This is a stupa, which is early Buddhism before they ever started portraying the body of the Buddha in their temples. They had this stupa, which they would walk around in circles. A 26-foot long Buddha I saw there, reclining Buddha. You might know that Islam is also very prevalent in India. Okay, the Taj Mahal is probably one of the most well known. Very beautiful. The artwork there, very intricate calligraphy, arabesque. And in Agra, I enjoyed going there. I was really smushed on a train uh, all the way from New Delhi to Agra. It, but it was worth it for sure, and I had a wonderful time there. I've had a great time on the trains of India too. Those are whole other stories. I was able to be there in 2005 for the 75th anniversary of the Salt March. And maybe you all know about the Salt March. That was one of Gandhi's most famous satyagrahas in 1930. He walked from his Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad to Dandi to make salt at a time that the British said it was against the law to make salt. They said they owned all the salt in India. So he had a protest and was imprisoned at the end of his march. So we had a commemoration. It was led by the great grandson of Gandhi named Tushar. So um, and while I was there, I had a chance to interview many people. So TK Venkataraman, for example, was there. He was a very humble and dedicated lifelong Gandhi devotee. And he came on the march, even though he said, you know, some politicians are just doing this for PR. They want to be famous. But I came here because I'm looking for people who still care about Gandhi's message for today. So that's what he did. Everywhere we went, all the school kids came out to greet us. And we went on the exact same path that Gandhi did while he was marching. And whichever town Gandhi stayed in, he would always give talks in the evening where he would bring up the issues he thought were most important, like khadi, wearing the hand spun cloth. You can see these kids dressed up as Gandhi. They are wearing khadi, as many of us were, because there's still a community of Gandhi activists who still do hand spinning and still make their living making hand spun cloth. Gandhi talked about that. He talked about ending caste discrimination. He talked about ending child marriages. He wanted girls to be able to go to school, all of those things in the historic Salt March. He talked about those reforms to India, as well as getting rid of the British. So he didn't want people to think the British were the only problem. He addressed a host of problems. He was also for, uh, of course, uh, ending no smoking cigarettes, no alcohol, all of those things. He had many, many issues he was concerned about. But one of the main ones was Hindu-Muslim unity. And in fact, they planned the 1930 Salt March. And so we did the same thing. We made sure we went from Hindu town to Muslim town to Hindu town to Muslim town, because he wanted his march to be about the unity of the society. He didn't want to see there being religious divides, which there were, because well, there had been some historical animosity between Hindus and Muslims, and also there were some politicians contemporary to Gandhi's time who wanted to exacerbate those problems. So he made sure that one of the key themes of this whole march was Hindu-Muslim unity. And so, Bill was asking me, what prayer should we do for Gandhi? And I thought, oh, the prayer that I know, the prayer that I sang thousands and thousands of times, because the march went for a month. And we sang this song a lot because that's what they did during the first march. Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram. Uh, Basically, what it's saying is, um, the names of God, uh, Sita Ram, and so it's saying Ishwar Allah Tero Nam, meaning is the Hindu God Ishwar Allah, the Muslim name for God. These are your names. You are one God. And so this song and this poem was intended to bring to emphasize this idea of Hindu-Muslim unity. While I was on the march, I met Shantilal Dada. He was 83 years old when I met him, but he was 9 years old in 1930 when he was on the Salt March, because his dad took him to go on the Salt March. And he was so anxious from age 9. When he became old enough, he wanted to join Gandhi, which he did at 20 years. And he spent his whole life basically a Gandhi activist. And he basically only owns a small bag on his shoulder. He has spent his entire life doing constructive work for the poor. And actually, Shantilal Dada was the guide for Thomas Weber, the Australian historian who wrote the huge book on the Salt March, which is the reconstructed oral history of this Salt March. A very good book. I read this book in preparation for walking on the Salt March. An amazing book. And Shantilal Dada said Gandhi could get people to risk their lives. Being in this Salt March, risk imprisonment. I also got to meet Rukshmani Bhatia, and I've actually written an article about her based on my interview with her. At age 14, she was in school and she heard the news. Mahadev Desai, the devotee of Gandhi, Gandhi's secretary, his adopted son, had died while they were being imprisoned, while Gandhi, Kasturba, and he were being imprisoned in the Aga Khan Palace. imprisoned for going against the British. And Rukshmani was so upset, and she thought the British killed him. Uh, he died of natural causes, but while in prison, she led a movement in the streets, a walkout of their school to protest the British. For this, she was arrested and put in juvenile detention. While she was in juvenile detention, the woman who guarded the juveniles gave her a copy of Gandhi's autobiography, which she read and basically became a lifelong Gandhi devotee. Her whole life, not marrying, living with her sisters in a simple life devoted to poverty. And so amazing stories like this I learned from people. Well, I also met Raj Mahatma Gandhi, one of the grandsons of Gandhi, and with him and his students from Illinois University, we went and visited this place where Gandhi was killed at the end of his life. And Rajmohan said, up to the last several years of Gandhi's life, up to the very end, what did he want more than anything? Hindu Muslim unity. He wanted the warring between these religions to end. Gandhi wanted the reconciliation between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so he was talking about that in our world since the September 11th attacks and all of this interreligious strife. That was something that Gandhi wanted to end. So, yes, and his ashes are here in New Delhi. So I wanted to say a little bit about his philosophy of nonviolence before I go back and tell you how it all started. Well, a small sliver of the story of how it all started. So this whole idea of patience. So Gandhi says, I am as impatient as the hottest congressman for the complete deliverance of the country from the foreign yoke. But I have no hate for a single Englishman, or for that matter, anyone on earth. So Gandhi was, you could say, this mix of we must do something, but what we must do must not be with hatred. It must be with love. And he didn't want to respond with violence because that would be emulating the perpetrator. So he talked about those who, like the British, uh, whether it's India or South Africa, would use their might to oppress others. And he says, we don't want to emulate them and how they use violence. Prove your strength by refusing to copy the lowly attacker, he said. Aggression is not power, it is weakness, and counter-aggression is doubly feeble. Now, he realized that ahimsa, or nonviolence, was an ideal that was very hard to reach because while we are embodied, we will fight to stay alive, and we will consume, causing the death of plants and animals. So true ahimsa is impossible, and yet he wants to say all persons can pursue the path of ahimsa. The Jains emphasize this refraining from killing, refraining from giving pain to others. They also emphasize refraining from harsh words. I've seen many Jains with a mask. And now we have masks for other reasons, coronavirus, but they would put a cloth over their face or a mask, even just to physically remind themselves that they could cause violence with their words. And they want to speak nonviolently, speak with love, refrain from harsh words, do not socially ostracize a person. But other versions of violence are when we hold on to something we don't need. Oh, I think St. Basil said that in the early Christian church. All those extra shoes and clothes you have, Don't hold on to what we don't need. Love our opponent even while non-cooperating with them. Now, what are realistic expectations? Gandhi often lived in ashrams and communities, and he said, let's not get into debates about killing snakes or germs, but let's look at our own actions. Has there been hatred in my heart? Harsh words? Have I shirked my work? Have I engaged in selfish actions? I should live the life of a brahmachari, not a self indulgent life. But it's also, you can find places in Gandhi's work where he says we need to train ourselves in nonviolence. How should we do it? We should nurse the sick, patrol dangerous areas of town, and rescue people in danger. That was his idea of how we practice nonviolence. So we don't just stay away from everyone and then we're nonviolent. We need to insert ourselves like Kim Redigan and Meta Peace Team and all those folks into situations of danger and act calmly and with love in those situations. Now, is aiming at this ideal unrealistic? There are times when Gandhi had to call off his nonviolent campaigns because some group got violent. And others would say, why are you calling off our campaign? Why can't we use violence? Maybe we can just use violence within limits. That's what some of his critics said. But Gandhi would say, no, those who compromise the ideal of ahimsa underestimate the destructive aspect of their acts. There will be long-term ill effects of violence that would undermine the short-term good. So, on the one hand, he said, if you care about the effects of your actions, you would know, be nonviolent. On the other hand, he didn't want people to be calculative, so concerned about the effects of their actions that they were making decisions based on what might work better. He said, engage in nonviolence because it is right without calculating the consequences. So you can see, as a philosophy professor, I can see, there's some of Kant's, not Kant, there's some deontologism, there's some utilitarianism, there's some concern for duty, there's some concern for actions, but he thought they would come together. A commitment to nonviolence because it was right, he was convinced would have the best effects, even if it doesn't seem like it. But you have to have faith that that's the case. Now, I told you before, I'm going to turn back the hands of time, just like those movies. We took a look at Gandhi's death. He was killed by an assassin. Well, even in that movie, they say, and now let's go back to the earlier time in Gandhi. How did Gandhi ever get to be that person who spent years and years leading so many nonviolent actions? He started out in South Africa. Do you realize that he lived there since 1893? Now, he was born in Pobandar, India in 1869. He went to England and studied law and became a lawyer before he went to South Africa. And he went to South Africa to work for some Indian merchants who had set up their businesses there. And he was a very successful attorney when you could say he had a kind of a midlife crisis where he started to realize that he shouldn't just be a well-to-do, somewhat rich lawyer in South Africa because people were suffering. Now, even as a lawyer, he had devoted himself to many causes, to causes of Indian immigrants who had limited rights in South Africa. And he had written 500 letters to the editor, many of which were decrying the racism of many of the laws of colonial South Africa. So he was very engaged in that way. But in addition to that, he started to have a spiritual experience and a spiritual change where he decided he needed to live a life of simplicity with those who toiled on the soil and give up these lawyerly city ways. So he really went through a big change. And you might know that he started a, a Phoenix settlement. It was a farm with his family and other multiple families living together. And it was a farm that grew crops that they could live on. But it was also a farm where they had a printing press. And in this printing press, they had a chance to write about the Gandhian philosophy of living simply on the land in community, and where he could also share his ideas of ahimsa or nonviolence. But did you know that Gandhi was not the first person to do exactly that? In fact, Gandhi owned this printing press before he ever published his own newspaper on it. He owned it as a business and somebody else ran it, even though Gandhi owned it. And people who ran the press ran it in Durban while Gandhi lived in Johannesburg as a lawyer. And one of the jobs that Gandhi's press had was it published the newspaper of John Dubé. Now, I don't know if any of you know who he is, but he would become the first president of the South African National SANNC, the precursor to the ANC. And John Dubé had come to the US. He had studied with Booker T. Washington in Tuskegee, and he went back to South Africa and he started his own community, the Olange Institute. And the Olange Institute published a newspaper, and you see the front page of the first issue of the paper. He published that newspaper on Gandhi's press in Durban. But after publishing his newspaper, Dubé decided he didn't want to have to pay Gandhi's press. He bought his own press and he moved it to Olange, this community in Natal. Now, exactly what John Dubé did, Gandhi did a few months later. So Gandhi started his newspaper in 1903. No, Dubé starts his newspaper and then he buys his own press and moves it to Olange Institute in Ananda. So Gandhi afterwards begins publishing his own paper, Indian Opinion, in June 1903, and he begins publishing his own ideas. Before that, he only wrote 500 letters to the editor in other people's newspapers. He said, right, if John Dubé can do it, so can I. And then he goes and buys a big farm right next to John Dubé in Olange, and he moves his printing press out there. So Dubé and Gandhi both have their printing presses in rural areas in communities that ran that press in addition to growing their own food. And in Dubé's case, in Olange Institute, they had all these industrial skills uh, workshops there. It was a real educational center for the Zulu people of that area of Natal. So you see these historical photos of Olange and Phoenix settlement, which is what Gandhi called his community. And then Gandhi started a second community called Tolstoy Farm, again with like 50 different communities. This Phoenix settlement was mostly Gujarati speaking Indians, and Tolstoy Farm was mostly Tamil speaking Indians. And a lot of the Tamil speaking Indians had been indentured laborers in South Africa, who then, at the end of their indenture, were joining Gandhi at his Tolstoy farm, where they were living together simply. Now, I want to suggest to you that Gandhi learned a lot about his political action in a context of South Africa, where Black South Africans were being very active politically. It was the beginnings of the ANC, and the women were also very active politically. Now, there's a great book by Ramchandra Guha, and he wrote a 600-page book just about Gandhi's life in South Africa. And in there, he has one sentence referring to the folks I'm about to tell you about. You know, for the first several years that Gandhi organized his nonviolent actions in South Africa, he only allowed men to participate. He finally broke down in 1913 and said women, including his own wife, could participate. And Guha says that may be because of his encounters with the suffragettes in England and Tamil women in the Transvaal. There was also the example of the African women of Orange Free State who had recently turned in their passes to the authority, pledging to never carry them again. And I think maybe even some of us who don't know a lot about Gandhi don't realize that he had all these living examples of nonviolent protests happening right in his country that he was living in nearby, and that Gandhi was writing about those movements in his newspaper as he was learning how to strategize himself. Now, there's going to be a few slides with a lot of words, and I'm just going to show you a little bit about them. But I do want to say that I'm not the first one to notice this. Nambusina Gasa is just one example of a Black South African woman who is working on the history of the women of Bloemfontein. Kalpana Hiralal has done some work on the women in Gandhi's movement and their pivotal role in pushing forward nonviolent action. Now, you don't have to read this whole thing, but in Gandhi's Indian Opinion, this is his own newspaper, he started writing articles about the British suffragettes and how the suffragettes were protesting at Parliament in Britain, and they were being arrested and prosecuted, and they refused to pay the fine. They would rather go to jail. And he's going, hence I would appeal to, right? So he's appealing not to his whole movement, he's appealing to the men in his movement that they should do what the women in Britain are doing. And again, he appeals to the men in his movement, saying, there are women in England who are protesting. They're being sent to jail. They're starving in those jails. And this is interesting because a lot of the fasting that the British women were doing in their protest to get the vote in Britain, there were precursors in Ireland. There were Irish traditions of fasting as a protest. And there were also Indian historical examples of fasting as a protest. And these historical examples were known by the British women, and they used this historical knowledge to decide to use fasting in jail as a protest in their movement. And then Gandhi is reporting on them in his newspaper and telling his movement, we must emulate these women. Now, there happens to be, a lot of times there's a man and he's got a right-hand woman doing all this work and we never know about her. Well, Sonia Sleshin was one of them. She was Gandhi's secretary. She was an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Russia who came to South Africa, and she was known for being a suffragette herself and very much proposing that the suffragettes had the right answer. And this is just a little thing about how she had her short hair, and she'd go, why waste time in fixing it? Should only males be free from that? Should all rights be reserved for men? This was Gandhi's secretary who basically ran his whole law office. And then when he started doing nonviolent actions, she oversaw thousands of people in jail and how to get them out of jail and how to house them and how to feed them. Sonia Sleshin, finally, she's being noticed. Charlotte Machiachi, she is a Black South African woman that led a group of women in Bloemfontein to protest the past laws. Like we have our Black Lives Matter movement here now. Machiachi organized and got 5,000 signatures on a petition and traveled with others to from Bloemfontein to Cape Town to the Cape Parliament to present those petitions. And of course, the petitions, they were shrugged off and it fell on deaf ears. So the women of Bloemfontein began to organize. And so I want to show you this map because if you take a look in South Africa, you have Bloemfontein at Orange Free State, Johannesburg, that's where Gandhi lived in his law offices. And then you have Durban, where his press was located before he moved to Phoenix Farm. And then he had a lot of his protests in 1913 right on the border between Orange Free State and and Natal. And the women I'm telling you about now had all their protests in Bloemfontein and Windburg and Jagersfontein, all these towns that are too small to show up on this map, but they are all right here. So these movements are next to each other in South Africa. And this in the middle is a very tall mountain range, but in this part of South Africa is not a tall mountain range. And this is where Gandhi was active. This was where the early ANC was active and where the women of Bloemfontein were active. And these women, Gandhi continues to write about the British suffragettes in his newspaper. And he notices that Emmeline Pankhurst refuses to eat for 8 days until she had to be taken to the hospital. So he's noting these details. He will soon use these same methods in his nonviolent action. So the women of Bloemfontein, the past laws were a real problem to them because many of them were employed doing laundry for white families, but there was such segregation in South Africa. So they had to get to a place where there was a place to do their laundry. These are 2 books that go into detail about it. And whenever they were carrying their passes, they could be, and in cases had been, bothered by the police. And even raped by the police. There was a case of a policeman who was actually found guilty of raping a woman under the pretext of he's checking her pass. Well, the good thing is at least this policeman was convicted for this. But nevertheless, the women in Bloemfontein said, we are at a disadvantage having to have this pass. We're being harassed by the police all the time. And they organized. And there was another newspaper, the APO, and they had headline stories. And the women courted arrest, 80 women were arrested on May 28th, 1913. Here is a picture. There's historical pictures. 80 were arrested on the first day. They refused to pay their fines. They were put in jail. This is exactly the methods. Gandhi had used them before with men, but he hadn't used them before with women. The women of Wittenberg also said they wouldn't carry their passes. So the Wittenberg police were arresting 6 Black women at a time and holding them for 2 weeks because they didn't have a bigger jail. This was part of Gandhi's whole strategy. Get so many people arrested at once, they don't have a jail big enough. Okay. Ruth Palulu was arrested in front of her students on August 15th, and the school closed down during her imprisonment. I think a lot of us don't know about these brave South African women. But Gandhi was writing about them in his newspaper. You see here, Native women, passive resistors. And he's writing all these details about their protests succeeding. Here they are, Native women's brave stand. They were being sentenced to hard labor, and they were suffering in prison. As you can see, this is August 2nd in Gandhi's Indian Opinion. In September, he starts his protest. Oh, here's a little quote where he says the South African women were more ladylike than the mean women of Britain. Okay. Saul Plaatje in his newspaper wrote about them. They're determined, right? They are determined to go against these past laws no matter what. Saul Plaatje, who was the treasurer for the ANC, but he had his own newspaper too. They will not, they will suffer in prison before they will dare to wear a pass. They will destroy their pass. And he also let the larger world know about their suffering in prison, because that was also part of how the method worked for the ANC and for Gandhi. And now I'm going to skip a few slides just to go to the part where Gandhi then goes to his communities and asks them. He says, oh, in the beginning, we thought it wasn't proper to send our women to jail in a foreign land. It would be derogatory to our manhood. But he's seeing all these South African women daring to go to jail. And in the meantime, his own wife wanted to go to jail. She had actually published an open letter in Indian Opinion with several other women back in 1908 asking Gandhi, can women please be part of his action? And he said, no, we can't. So now finally in 1913, he says, yes, you can be part of it. And Kasturba Gandhi, his wife, is one of the first to get arrested. So he writes about it in Indian Opinion. First, he writes that they say they're going to do it, but it's several months before they do it. Kasturba goes, she crosses Transvaal, she gets sentenced to 3 months of hard labor. And she was really suffering in prison. Tamil women from Tolstoy farm also crossed. They were not arrested. What did they do when they weren't arrested? They went to a place where Indian indentured laborers were working, and they got those men to strike. And they got those men to strike because they said, Kasturba Gandhi and other women are suffering in prison. And out of concern for the women, the men had a strike. And that's how the strike grew so much. Kalpana Hurlal said it was the public speeches of these women that got so many men to strike, that it wouldn't have been successful without the women. There was the first martyr to this nonviolent action, Valiama. She was 16 years old. She was so malnourished and overworked in prison, she died a few days after getting out of prison. Kasturba in jail had become very thin. And for several days after his own wife, Kasturba, was let out of jail, Gandhi was worried that she would die. But she was slowly nursed to health. It was only after Kasturba fasted in jail that Gandhi did his first public fast for a cause later in the same year. So really, Kasturba had fasted for a cause first, even though Gandhi is so famous for doing it. There were so many other women who were very important in Gandhi's movement. You may know Sarojini Naidu. She's a little famous because she's in the Gandhi movie. But she was involved. She came to South Africa and she was involved in the movement in South Africa too. But she was part of the Salt March. And she actually led, after Gandhi was imprisoned, Sarojini Naidu led that several hundred marchers who nonviolently faced the British, even though they were being hit with these lathis, where several were hospitalized and dead. Sarojini Naidu led the movement after Gandhi got arrested. So the women have had a really big role in his movement. And basically, later he went to discuss with the British for the independence of Africa. Sarojini Naidu came with him. And basically, that's my presentation. I want to thank you all for listening. And I look forward now to answering any questions you may have. And in fact, let me stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. And I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you learned something about his philosophy, his methods.
So let's all give Gail a Zoom applause and thank you very much. It's especially really so amazing to hear this side of Gandhi's life and how much he was influenced by the women in the movement. That's I'm really thankful for your sharing. So Marge, I don't know if you've received any questions in the chat.
I haven't yet, but I'm hoping to soon. Oh, here's one. Hold on, but by too fast. How did the women get so lost in the history?
Well, I'll tell you. It's the story of women throughout history all the time. They get lost. But I have to say that since the 60s and the civil rights movements, the field of history has really had a reckoning, and they've realized, oh, we've just been writing what the kings and are doing, and what the military's doing, and what the presidents are doing. What about the women? And so there's been a real challenge to historical methodology lately. So the stories of the women have been written and the little people, right? So just like there's that book by Danwell McGuire about, everyone looks at King and thinks King did everything. And oh, there were women who organized for years before King came to Montgomery. They had things going already, but King becomes famous. So the same thing with Gandhi. Now, I don't want to belittle Gandhi's role. He was a great galvanizer of a movement, and he was a keen observer of what worked, and he wanted to repeat it. Um, but you can see that Gandhi, in his own lifetime, put the women in the headlines of his newspaper. And in fact, there were several progressive newspapers, uh, different language newspapers for the different African languages, and they would often republish stories of what was going on in each other's communities. And so Gandhi republished these stories, but it seemed to me, and this is my own thing, by the way, because I was interested in both South Africa and Gandhi, and I was reading a lot of different literature, realizing there were South African historians telling the story of the Bloemfontein women, and then there were maybe some Indian South Africans telling Gandhi's story, but I never anywhere saw these two stories told together, except in a sentence or two here or there. So I've been researching, and I've been going into the archives and finding every news article where they talk about each other's movements and building a case that they actually were learning from each other. That's something I'm trying to add to the history. But I'm not doing the history from scratch. I'm just finding the women are finally written into history here, and the women are finally written into history here. Let's put it together. This is this is a patchwork. Let's see the connections that were there to get a fuller picture of all the influence of Gandhi. It wasn't just Tolstoy. It wasn't just, Tagore. It wasn't just these men, Ruskin, who influenced him. It was John Dubé, and then it was Charlotte Machiachi. Many of these influences.
Another question was the plowshares activists protesting the U.S. nuclear weapons often destroy property, especially of arms manufacturers. What do you think of that tactic?
Oh, okay. So, well, first of all, I can say what Gandhi would say, and basically, I'm kind of okay. So Gandhi has a very high ideal for nonviolence, right? We don't want to we don't want to say any harsh words. In Gandhi's own movement, for example, the Quit India movement, there was a faction of the movement that wanted to do some sabotage things like cut down telegraph lines and railroad, stop the railroad from running. And some people said Gandhi would want us to do this. And Gandhi, first of all, he was in prison and the British wouldn't let him communicate with anyone. But when he finally got out, he said, I would not have said this. This would not have been my choice. He didn't want to engage in acts of sabotage against the British. He wanted to challenge them nonviolently through self-suffering. But now, when you come to Plowshares actions, and remember these Plowshares actions are happening a couple of decades after Gandhi passes. So Dan Berrigan says something very interesting, right? And those of you who were there and heard what Dan Berrigan makes the argument, We are not destroying property because these weapons are anti-property. Do you remember that? It's not just a trick. It's really asking, what is the concept of property? And usually we think property has to be protected. Why? Because it's valuable, because somebody's labor went into the property. Well, yes, labor is going into nuclear missiles, but nuclear missiles destroy not only property, but also lives. And so Dan Berrigan made an argument that it was anti-property. But in addition, you could argue that the plowshares, they do some damage, but the damage is mostly symbolic. Uh, they're engaging in action because they're trying to raise awareness. Yes, if they can also stop a nuclear missile from going off, it's good. But it's an educational action to raise awareness. Gandhi was very hesitant about destroying property in the midst of your protest. I mentioned 1913 is when he's watching these women in Bloemfontein nonviolently protesting their passes, ending up in jail. But 1913, there were also violent protests. There were the violent protests of white workers in Pretoria who burned down the train station. And Gandhi was actually in Pretoria and witnessed some of this and wrote all about what he saw, and he was aghast. And Mrs. So-and-so, I'm trying to remember the name. There was a woman, I want to say Gandhi does have a bit of a hang up about women being ladylike or women protect, because he kept going on and on. This socialist woman was burning down the train station, and this was a bad thing. Gandhi was really worried that if you didn't have nonviolent guidelines, people were going to get hurt and they were going to be swept up in this anger or rage, which is not how he wanted his protests conducted. So he very much wanted them to be a nonviolent protest. Now, you could argue the plowshares people are so prayerful and they're not in a mob and they're not like trying to set something on fire. So you could argue that their prayerful symbolic destruction of property would be along Gandhi's lines. But Gandhi is very careful about those things in general.
Another question was, as I understand it, in South Africa, Gandhi compromised with the British to protect Indian rights at the expense of reform for Blacks. Is that accurate?
Okay, so now there's been a lot in the news the last few years, and I've read some of the criticisms. I've read some of the most critical books on Gandhi. I want to try to explain this, because it's one thing to say that Gandhi's his work for many decades as a lawyer was focused on the Indian community. He talked about them first, their troubles. He went to court for them. He was afraid that the anti-immigration laws of South Africa were going to push immigrants out of South Africa. Most of them came there as indentured workers. At the end of their indenture, they had been promised that they would get some land, like 40 acres and a mule. They had been promised they would get some land and a cow. But oftentimes, those promises were not followed through, because what would happen is the British, and then later the South Africans, when South Africa gets independence in 1910, would place all these taxes on the Indians and say, now you owe a 3-pound tax. I mean, the tax got whittled down to 3 pounds, and Gandhi's nonviolent action was to try to get rid of even the 3 pounds, which was a huge amount back then. But the the British and then the white South African government put that tax on Indians to kind of force their hand so that they couldn't live as free people in South Africa. They would either have to re-indenture because they couldn't afford the tax, or they would have to go back to India. So the Indians, many Indians in India, they had a difficult time, but Black South Africans were also very much having a difficult time. And year after year, the laws against Black South Africans were getting worse and worse. But I think we have to see that Gandhi was in solidarity with Black South Africans on so many issues. So I would think that it would be wrong to say that he cared about Indians at the expense of Black South Africans. He worked for the rights of Indians, but in his letters to the editor and in his own newspaper for years, he defended Black South Africans' rights to maintain their property, to not be taken off of their property, to hold office. Did you know that in certain parts of South Africa that Blacks could hold office? And those laws were finally eroded by the independent South African government in 1910. But that Gandhi went with a delegation from South Africa to England to protest the rolling back of those laws. He was friends with some of the politicians who held positions in the government. He wanted the franchise to be non-racial. Now, it was still a narrow franchise because just like in the US, where there were property qualifications, education qualifications, but the point is he wanted the franchise to be non-racial. And so there are many ways in which part of what I do, and I just didn't have time to do it, was to show how Gandhi in his newspaper advertised the causes of Black South Africans. When John Dubé would give a speech, he would have that speech summarized in his newspaper. So, and he had working relationships with Abdur Rahman, who had the APO newspaper, which was covering the women of Bloemfontein's protests. You saw that Gandhi had the women from Bloemfontein's protests on his front page. So now I know that some people say, you know, Gandhi was not part of a cross-racial unified movement. He felt like that wasn't his role. And you can also remember when he was in India and people said, Gandhi, come to the US. He said, you just run your movement in US. I'm staying here in India and I'm dedicated to my movement here in India. So I don't think that his deciding that he had a more limited role meant that he was against other people. Now, I know why some of these other authors think Gandhi was against them, because they find quotes. There are quotes. I don't want to deny there are quotes. And I don't want to say that Gandhi had no racism. I mean, who could say that? He also had some gender. I mean, he was a great champion of women, but he also said things about women and treated women in certain ways at certain times that you say this was not ideal, like not letting women be part of his movement. So I know you can find quotes from Gandhi where Gandhi says something that's dismissive or derogatory of Black South Africans. And there are times when he makes it sound like we're not like that. So I don't want to say that he never said anything like that, but I think it's going too far to think that he didn't care about them. He had actual multiple acts of solidarity, enough that the ANC really built on his movement, and members of Gandhi's family, like Gandhi's son Manulal, who lived in South Africa, and his descendants for the rest of their lives worked very closely with the ANC from the time that Gandhi left South Africa in 1914. So I think these things also have to be known about him as well.
Okay, another question. Gandhi's movement was to be a part of a subversion of empire. What empire do you see that we need to subvert globally and here in the United States? It's a loaded question.
Okay, and it's so interesting because, I mean, connected to the question before, the critics of Gandhi, there's actually a book on Gandhi called Gandhi, Stretcher Bearer of Empire, where the authors are saying Gandhi loved the British Empire, and he actually, through his nonviolence, we could have got rid of the empire faster violently, but he was always, too nice to the empire. And Gandhi, as during his time in South Africa, was very proud of, we are citizens of the empire and we have our citizens' right. And he thought that British law in the ideal had many things that could be praiseworthy, but he saw so much hypocrisy, and he saw so many ways where the British did not live up to their ideals, and where the British had segregation as a practice and discrimination on race as a practice. And so he knew that too. And so it was just a matter of time before, but it wasn't immediate, because a few times he admitted, okay, let's help the British Empire. They're in trouble, and it's a world war and we have to help them out. Emmeline Pankhurst did the same thing. That same British woman who was like getting buildings burnt and ending up in jail in Britain for the vote, she also said, oh, we have to support Britain during the war. But Gandhi, you could say, regretted. He went through a deep depression after that World War, because he kept realizing that the more you help empire, you think that they're finally going to learn the error of their ways and finally live out the justice they've been talking about, and then they don't, So then he finally really did fight empire and led this movement to get rid of the British Empire. Oh, now what are the empires today? The US is the superpower, and certainly, here we are living inside this superpower that likes to threaten other parts of the world through use of nuclear weapons. And we like to meddle in other people's elections. Unfortunately, the US has a history of doing that. And I just only hope that, since so many in the nation are realizing how important it is to have a free and fair election, let's let some other countries have their free and fair election, instead of going down there, backing a certain candidate with millions of dollars, and like our own empire has done in many Central American countries. So we have ideals as a country, but we don't always live up to them. There's a lot of hypocrisy. We have to go through the same realizations that Gandhi did about the empire he lived in. And the nonviolent action, as he mentioned, is a good way to respond, because the nonviolent action is, let's do something together. Let's withdraw our cooperation from an unjust government. And so examples like, blockading the pipeline, Black Lives Matter, all of those things are calling our government to live up to its ideals and stop the repression and stop the discrimination.
You mentioned stopping during World War II. One person said that Gandhi suspended his movement
Oh,
against the Brits when they were battling Hitler because he said that nonviolence wouldn't work against the Nazis because it was impossible to arouse their consciences. What do you think about that?
okay, so I have to make a little correction. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, first of all, what I had mentioned before was Gandhi supporting the British during World War I. So I hadn't mentioned World War II, but Gandhi's position on World War II was he wasn't going to just say, oh, I'll do anything for the British, because he knew there was this problem of British hypocrisy. And he said, the British are saying, oh, now we have to help them. We have to supply troops for World War II because they have to make the world safe for democracy. In the meantime, they won't let India rule itself. That is hypocritical. And so it was Gandhi's position that if Britain wanted India to help, it had to give India its freedom first and then ask a free India whether or not it wants to help. That it shouldn't first make its colony supply troops to World War II. So Gandhi was actually against this idea of helping out Britain in World War II. The thing that he withheld is he said we shouldn't start this huge non-cooperation campaign that would paralyze the country while Britain is having a war. He thought that was a case of, getting them when they're down. But he withheld the non-cooperation campaign all the way till 1942, and then at a certain point he said, we can't wait anymore. We can't say, oh, just let Britain have one more war and then we'll ask for our independence. We have to ask for it now. And he started the Quit India movement in August of 1942, where he told people, do or die. Now, when he said do or die, he still meant a nonviolent movement. That was the example where I told you some people said, oh, do or die, that sounds like do anything. I'm going to, cut these wires, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the reason people thought that is because one very trusted Gandhi follower told people that's what Gandhi meant. And that was Kisharlal Mashruwala, who actually lived at Sevagram Ashram and was in charge of one of Gandhi's printing presses. But Gandhi made it clear, no, he didn't want people to violently, through sabotage, disagree with and oppose. He wanted them to oppose through a non-cooperation campaign along the lines of the Salt March. You disobey laws, you end up in jail. And Gandhi was in jail through most of World War II. He was jailed in Aga Khan Palace, and which they turned into, sometimes he was jailed in an actual jail. At that point, they jailed him in a palace with his wife and with Mahadev Desai. Both of them died during that time. It was a time of mourning for Gandhi. So Gandhi did not support the British during World War II, but he wasn't against them either. It's not like he wanted Hitler to win. He wanted Hitler to be defeated nonviolently instead of through a war. And he came to that because of his disillusionment with World War I and his conviction that nonviolence is better than violence. So I do want to clarify that Gandhi actually thought the Germans could win using nonviolence. It was Gandhi's opponents who thought it was impossible to arouse the consciences of the Nazis. And there are several writings of Gandhi. Now, his critics say you're stupid, Gandhi. There's no way. Hitler is killing 6 million people. He doesn't have a conscience. How are you going to succeed nonviolently? Well, the folks who say that, I'm not saying it's easy, but the folks who say that don't understand how Gandhi's method works, because it's not like Gandhi's method works if only Hitler suddenly realizes he's doing something wrong. Gandhi's 1913 Satyagraha, it succeeded because it roused sympathy with thousands and thousands of people who then withdrew their cooperation. And it aroused sympathy with, you could say, sometimes even the wives of those powerful white racist leaders of South Africa. Their wives or friends of their wives are writing saying, don't you know there's women suffering in jail? And don't you know there's 40,000? A lot of those indentured servants were basically in used as prison labor and taken right back to their plantation or their mine, where they had to work at gunpoint and were shot if they wouldn't work. And so these atrocities happened, but they were reported. And then you have a whole women's movement putting pressure on male politicians saying, you can't let this happen. And that's how those laws were repealed. It's not because, just the person at the top suddenly says everything I've done in my life is wrong. It is talking about a wide range of pressure. And there are many people who say movements like that partially succeeded across Europe. There are places where there were nonviolent resistances.
Mhm.
There are places where German women whose Jewish husbands were all put in a prison, they encircled that prison nonviolently until the guards decided to let their husbands out. There are places in Denmark and other places where Jewish people were hidden and were not handed over to the Nazis. I mean, there are so many cases where nonviolence was used during World War II. Could it have worked if nobody raised a gun, anywhere? I mean, these are questions about history, but that was Gandhi's position during the war. But one more thing about Gandhi in World War II. Gandhi was the head of the Indian National Congress, but there were others who wanted to be the president. And there was a guy, Subhash Chandra Bose, in 1942. He so much wanted Britain out of India that he actually went to Germany and tried to work with the Nazis. This is nothing that Gandhi did. Gandhi did not want to cooperate with the British in their war, but he never would have gone over to the Nazis and said, can you help us get rid of the British in India? But that's what Subhash Chandra Bose did. And the Germans told him, go to Japan. And the Japanese told him, go to, uh, uh, it starts with S, right next to Japan somewhere, where the Japanese had conquered an Indian colony, and they had all of these Indian conquered troops there. Bose went there, and the Japanese let Bose take those troops, and they were going to try to attack the British across from Burma. So, I mean, there were some people in the Indian National Congress who were actually wanting to work with the Germans and the Japanese during World War II to get the British out of India. But Gandhi always insisted on nonviolent action.
There was a question about Gandhi doing organizing of the Dalits, the untouchables. Did he organize them? And with the new book out, Caste, what is the state of the untouchables in India today?
Oh, okay. And I don't know if I know the book Caste, but I want to show you the book I know. Colored Cosmopolitanism by Nico Slate. This book goes into great detail about Gandhi's position on caste over the years. His position changes over time. Now, Gandhi was from the Vaishya caste, the caste of merchants. And he came from a Hindu family that had a certain caste. And when he wanted to go to England as a young man, he had to ask permission of the folks who were in charge of his caste at the time. Or there's a Varna is this system saying there are four castes: the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. And then the untouchables were added later. They're nowhere mentioned in the holy books of the Vedas, but they socially arose as an exploited group of people who basically got that designation through their family, inherited. So Gandhi had to ask members of his jati, his local caste, for permission, and they wouldn't give him permission. But he really wanted to go. So he asked his mother for permission, and his mother famously said, "If you keep these vows, I will give you my permission." And the vow was no womanizing because he's married, no eating meat, no tobacco, and be a vegetarian. If you can do all those things while you're in Britain, I will let you go. And so he goes with his mother's blessing. He was shunned by all members of his caste for basically most of the rest of his life. So, I mean, this was his experience of caste is people gang together and they really enforce their rules. And caste is such a part of Indian identity that even people in the lowest caste can really cling to their identity. But it is unfortunately the kind of identity where there's always someone lower than you. So it's like, we're the good ones. You know, we might be caste number 14, but there's some people caste 16, or they're not even a caste. And so it really is a problem. And it has a lot of overlap with racism. And Gandhi was against caste, but he grew to be even more and more against caste as the years went by. So his views changed. And it's true, you can look at some of his early views on caste are not as strident as his later views. So we have to see the development of it. But caste discrimination is something he was against. But in the beginning, like when Gandhi first came back from South Africa to India in 1914, in the beginning, he made a distinction between caste discrimination and caste itself. So if you look at the things he says in the 1920s, he says he's not against caste, he's only against caste discrimination. What could that mean? Well, what Gandhi said is, the Vedas say there are these four castes, but they say these are just four different ways of serving God, and each one of them is holy. So remember, Gandhi is somebody who, from his time in South Africa, was trying to overcome these castes. There were people of different castes living in his Phoenix farm, in his Tolstoy farm, and he was always like, we all have to clean the latrine. Now, in a caste system, that was a job for the lowest caste or the untouchables. So, but he was like, Sanitation is next to godliness. We are all taking turns at cleaning the bathroom. And so, I mean, that was unheard of in the Indian community at his time, but he insisted on it. And through the influence of John Dubé, his neighbor, and John Dubé was influenced by Booker T. Washington, for better or worse. I mean, Booker T. Washington was not maybe the most progressive, but he was a big champion of African Americans and this idea of self-reliance and this idea of the dignity of labor. And so Gandhi really took that to heart. And he was like, manual labor is the way to live. Tolstoy was doing the same thing, right? Tolstoy, the aristocrat who gave up his aristocrats and said, no, we have to live by manual labor. So insofar as this caste idea was, there's the better people and the lesser people, and the people who toil the soil are lower than the teachers, and the lowest are the ones who sweep the streets and the latrines. Gandhi was against that. His whole idea of the dignity of labor, but that didn't always mean that he wanted caste to disappear, because he liked the idea that different people have different ways of glorifying God. Some do it as teachers, some do it as merchants, some do it as laborers, some do it cleaning cleaning the latrine. He wanted all of those occupations to have dignity, and because of that, maybe he was too, some people, and I think you can show, he didn't discriminate against caste altogether as soon as he should have. But actually, he learned a lot from African Americans on this, because there were African Americans who came to India to meet him, and they had long talks with him about what it's like to live in a situation of racism in America. And they really challenged him to not just give up on caste discrimination, but this whole idea of caste. And people can show how Gandhi's ideas of like desegregate, de, cross caste marriages, for example, these are things that he began to embrace in the 30s and in the 40s. Now, oftentimes, when people try to understand Gandhi's view on caste, they might contrast him to someone like Ambedkar. Ambedkar is known as the Dalit champion who wanted equal rights. He wanted the Constitution to give even special rights to Dalits to make sure they have positions in government. And I mean, Ambedkar did great work. And in the beginning, Gandhi um, had views different than Ambedkar. Gandhi still wanted uh, the eradication of this idea of untouchability, but he wanted Hindus to accept untouchables. And Ambedkar was someone who was so disillusioned with Hindus. He wanted Dalits to convert to another religion. And you might know that for a while he was thinking that maybe they should convert to Islam. But in the end, Ambedkar asked Dalits to convert to Buddhism, because Buddhism was another one of those historical religions in India that from the beginning, Jainism and Buddhism, remember those temples, Ellora and Ajanta Caves, they've all been there since 6th century BCE. But the Jains and the Buddhists did not have caste. Only the Hindus did. So Ambedkar said we should all convert to Buddhism, right? And so in the 30s, Gandhi was really trying to talk to fellow Hindus. We need to embrace the untouchables. We don't want them to convert to Buddhism. I mean, of course, people are free to do what they do, but Gandhi wanted Hindus to have a change of heart and a change of practice. But people will show, and if you read Nico Slate, and if you read Anil Noria, another friend of mine in India who's written books on Gandhi, really, as the years go by, Gandhi and Ambedkar's positions come close to each other. But there are still some people who think Gandhi and Ambedkar are opposites. And if you like Ambedkar, you can't like Gandhi. But really, Gandhi does take up the position and realizes by the end of his life, not only caste discrimination, but even caste must be eradicated from India.
I think we're just about out of time. We didn't get to all the questions, but I'm going to turn this back over to Bill for our closing.
Okay, thank you, Marge, and thank you to everyone who, again, was with us tonight and for the great questions. And Gail, thank you for your presentation. You talked about devotees of Gandhi. I hesitate to put that label on you, but what you have certainly done tonight is deepen our understanding and appreciation for Gandhi and for all that he has contributed to nonviolence. And so for that, we're very grateful. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Susan for the technical assistance tonight. She's in the far corner there of your screen, and all throughout our program, she's really helped things run smoothly. I'd like to thank the Jesu Peace and Justice Committee and the Beloved community for co-sponsoring. For all our guests, all of you, we could not do this without your being part of this. It would have been a little boring for 4 or 5 of us to show up every night. So thank you for being here with us. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say a special thank you to Marge Sears for having the vision for this program in the first place and for shepherding it successfully from start to finish. So thank you, Marge.
Thank you, Marge.
And I would like to just do a short closing prayer. This is another that's attributed to Gandhi, and I see this as kind of a blessing and a hope. And you can kind of imagine Gandhi speaking to you. I offer you peace. I offer you love. I offer you friendship. I see your beauty. I hear your need. I feel your feelings. My wisdom flows from the highest source. I salute that source in you. Let us work together for unity and peace. Amen. So go gently, as a mentor of mine was wont to say, and blessings and all.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for
Thank you
listening and
all.
inviting me to be part of this.
Ah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Gail.
Bill.
Thank you, Gail.
That's great.
Okay.